Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, The Other Side of Trauma, Supporting Newcomers Through Healing and Resiliency-Centered Engagement. My name is Sabrina Dimitra and I'm AMSA Settlement Coordinator. I will be going through a few housekeeping items before I hand the webinar over to Diana Jeffries from Pacific Immigrant Resources Society, otherwise known as PIRS, who will be leading us through the content portion of today's event. And so I would like to now hand over the webinar to Diana Jeffries from Pacific Immigrant Resources Society, PIRS, to lead us through the content of today's event. Thank you, Diana.
Oh, thanks very much, Sabrina. And it's a real pleasure to be here with AMSA and to provide this this webinar with you. So this webinar is called The Other Side of Trauma, Supporting Newcomers Through Healing and Resiliency-Centered Engagement. This is the second part of a two-part series on trauma and the settlement sector. The first part that I did back in November was called Community-Based Training for Working with Immigrants and Refugees, a Trauma-Informed Approach. And in the first part, we sort of went through what the definition of trauma is for newcomers, the PIRS framework for a trauma-informed practice, which is addressed in all of our published resources, how trauma shows up in the classroom, how to address trauma, the issues of trauma, and some practical tools that you can use to support those with trauma. And so you can find this webinar on the AMSA website or at the PIRS website at www.pirs.ca. So we will start off today's with, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background on PIRS programs, learning for all women of all ages and stages with or without children. So PIRS started in 1975 with the intention of supporting refugee women and their young children. All of our classes and our workshops, our resources are learner-centered, and all of our practitioners are trauma-informed. The English language classes are for female identified women, and we offer childcare as well. And as you can see in the photos, you can see that we also offer childcare for, well, we allow younger children under 18 months to be in the classrooms with their mothers if they feel it's needed. So we're just really trying to work hard at creating an environment where it's inclusive for all types of newcomer women. And we accept participants with or without status or precarious status. How we work is we partner with community organizations in Vancouver and Burnaby and New Westminster and in Surrey. And we provide English language classes, employment programs, leadership programs, and we also have a social innovation project with a mobile childcare program. So my role at PIRS is to provide training within the education, settlement, and health sectors on trauma-informed practice for practitioners who are working with immigrants and refugees. And all of our staff at PIRS are women who have had the lived experience of migration, and we do our best to provide quality employment and volunteer opportunities for immigrant and refugee women. So today's agenda, I'm just going to go through it with you. It's probably about 60 minutes, and then following that, as Sabrina said, that I will be taking questions and hopefully providing some answers for you. So we'll just review what a trauma-informed practice is, types of trauma experienced by newcomers after arrival in Canada. So in the first webinar, I talked a lot about trauma experiences people have prior to arrival, but I also want to really address the concerns that people have within Canada. I will also provide some research findings. We will do a case study. I will talk about healing-centered approaches and honoring resiliency, implementing trauma-sensitive and informed community spaces, recognition of post-traumatic growth, and then a little bit on self-care and questions and answers. I hope that works for everybody, and I'm really looking forward to some of your questions at the end here. So Before we get into the content, I'm going to ask that we do a sort of breathing activity for a kind of self-regulation. So when I was a teacher, this is how I would start my class at the beginning of every class. And what I found for me and for my students is that it really helped with the mind and body connection. It also helped people settle into the present. It helped for connecting participants to each other and in a sort of supportive and inclusive learning space. So if you feel comfortable to do so, you can close your eyes, or maybe what is more comfortable for you is to lower your gaze a bit and focus on either the photo, which is a photo I took off of Pender Island, and that's on your screen, or some other natural object like a vase of flowers, a plant, a tree outside your window, whatever you have around you. It's really important to focus on something that is in the natural world rather than sort of a pen or a pencil or a piece of paper. So if you don't have natural items in your classroom or your office, you may consider getting one. Nature is a key piece in healing approaches for trauma. So this is just a kind of reminder or a suggestion to have these tools such as photos of nature and living plants in your workspace. So if you are focusing on the screen at the picture or a plant or flower or a tree outside, that's great. And what I'm just going to ask is that you breathe through your nose and then slowly release the breath through your mouth. And we will do this 3 times. So breathe in and slowly breathe out through your mouth. And again, breathe in and slowly out through your mouth. And one more time. So I'm hoping that you have that sense of a bit more sense of calm or peace. As I say, this is really, really helpful for students. And if you're doing it as sort of classroom activity, a collective activity, don't get them to sit at their desk, but ask them to stand up and create a circle. And it's sort of bringing the group into a sense of connection and with each other. So it's very helpful. Okay, so a little bit of review about what is trauma. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary system of care that gives people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror and evoke the responses of catastrophe. So this is a quote by Dr. Judith Herman. She's an American psychiatrist and a teacher and an author who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery: From Domestic Abuse to Political Terror. And when I and my former colleague at PIRS, Dr. Amy Wilbur, started doing these workshops on trauma-informed approaches, we thought that this was a really good quote to guide us through to develop a trauma-informed framework that PIRS now uses for all of our curriculum development projects and the training that I do for PIRS childcare, outreach workers, and teachers for professional development. And this is the same quote that was used in the Part 1 webinar that I did for AMSA back in November. And what I think is really what is particularly important and how we've developed the framework is the idea of control, connection, and meaning. So control being the sense of control over your body and your thoughts, to have a sense of agency for making decisions. Connection is how are you able to connect to your community, in the case for language learners, connect to your the other students in the class. And then meaning is about, now that you are here, what is next for you? What are some of those things that provide you with a sense of value and purpose in your life moving forward? I want to talk a little bit about what the types of trauma refugees experience. And then I'll go into talking about the traumas that people here experience after arrival in Canada. So this is a list. This list is the type of trauma experience that I have known about throughout my career in the settlement sector. This list is what I have learned from students and clients of mine that have disclosed their trauma experiences to me. And I'm not saying it's complete, but it is perhaps some of the trauma students and clients in your own programs have faced. So fear is a common one, the sense of great insecurity, fear of violence in war zones, gang violence. Often after a war, there's a surge and rise in gang activities. And that, so even though, for example, in a place like Afghanistan, where the war in itself is over, but there are just as many other kind of violent insecurities that people are faced with daily. Loss of family and friends, loss of home and community, forced migration and exile from their home country, children that have been born in the middle of a battle, extreme government oppression, torture, being kidnapped, lack of food and water, refugee camps in itself can be a traumatic place, domestic violence, sexual assault, interrupted education, prison, and self-imposed prison. So, for example, being in self-imposed prison, I used to know a couple of young girls who hadn't left their home, their apartment in Iraq for, at the time it had been 3 years, and then they came to Canada. So they had been, basically in prison in their own homes. You may have other types of trauma experiences that you know about that you could add to it. But the types of traumatic experiences newcomers face in Canada is also not to be overlooked, because the trauma doesn't end at a border. People also have experienced traumas through their migration journey process, and there are also some types of trauma I know that my students and clients also have experienced whilst in Canada. And this list is not the only experiences of trauma, and you may add to this from your own experience and work yourself. But certainly things like being racialized, so suddenly you are in a society where your ethnicity is not the dominant group, and certainly coming to Canada, where it's an extremely multiracial kind of society, it might be really unusual, an unusual sort of experience. But racism does very much exist in our society, and can be a real trauma for people when they think they're in a place that's safe, and then they find out that no, there are people that do discriminate. And certainly religious discrimination or suspicion, and we have seen that particularly in the last few years, for those who practice in the Islamic faith, for example, that they've been under immense scrutiny and suspicion for their religious beliefs. Negative attitudes towards refugees. This has also been a surge, and people worrying about refugees costing us a lot of taxpayers' money, or they're taking jobs away, or they're secretly they're involved in terrorist activities, that kind of thing. There are other experiences of trauma that people experience here are despair over the loss of connection with family and friends who now live in other countries or are still in war zone areas. So I know of many students of mine who had a child in Canada, but then they had another child in Sweden or in Germany or in Australia. And it was very hard to imagine when and where they were ever going to meet again. And also things like the inability to communicate in your first language outside of the home. You may have never needed to learn a second language in your life, and now you're in Canada and you're expected if to learn English, and that might be a whole new and really challenging experience. Unsure of the social mores, like how do people do things in Canada? How do we, you know, line up for the bus, or do we ask permission to use the washroom in a restaurant, or whatever it is that the sort of conduct and behavior that people have are unclear and unsure, and especially in a very multicultural like Canada, where there are not really any very, very prescriptive social roles that people necessarily always play. So it's sometimes hard to read what is the right way and sort of quote, quote, the wrong way of doing things. Loss of identity. So for example, maybe you were the breadwinner in your family back in your first country. You had a good job and a level of authority, and then you're here, and all of a sudden you don't have that identity to your work. You've taken a minimum wage job, and that is a huge loss of identity for many people. Alienation, the sense that you are sort of looking through the glass window, you don't connect, you're not part of what's really going on. You're just continuously being in the position of an observer of what's happening in the society. And then disconnection. So maybe you have lost, or you no longer are able to see close friends or family, and so you're disconnected. You haven't been able to make new friends in Canada, and you don't know how to go about making that happen. And then there's the shame and guilt, which is also what I talked about in the last webinar. Shame being, about very, very closely related to experiences of trauma. Those who have had severe cases of trauma, like domestic abuse or rape or torture, often have the same feelings of shame, that there's something wrong with them, that they don't have, that they don't matter, that there's something really, really negative about who they are as a human being. And then guilt being, well, you are safe, that, if I were suddenly in Canada and I've left my loved ones back in my own first country, and they're not safe and I am, there can be a sense of guilt with that. The guilt of not being able to provide for your family members or friends back home. The guilt that you have really lost all of your life that in your first country, and you're not able to provide in the same way. So I want to go on from there to talk about a case study. So we're going to look at this case study, but before I do, I want to give you some sort of just questions to think about while I read it out to you. I want you to think about what's going on for this student in a classroom and her family. And how does her behavior and attitude make you feel? Are you frustrated, angry, hurt, sad, annoyed, worried? What is your feeling about it? And then I want you to think about, what can you do to support this person, this girl? And who can you call on for support in your organization? So I chose this case study because I think for many language teachers working with newcomers, this is not an extreme situation, in that she is not a danger to herself or to others, particularly in an obvious way. And she's not particularly disruptive in the classroom. But it's still somebody that is really struggling with her own experiences of trauma. So I'm going to read it, and you can read along with me. Then we'll go back, and I'm going to answer those questions, but if you have more questions you want to put in there, we'll take that up at the end. So Marla was an extremely bright and disciplined university student in her first country. Since she started in her English class here in Canada, her attitude towards learning has changed. She doesn't have problems with aggression or disruptive behavior in her English class, but instead she stares at the window of the classroom, despondent and uninterested in any of the classroom activities. She doesn't participate, doesn't talk to the other students, and rarely brings a notebook to class. Despite her intelligence, she is falling behind, and more often she is either late to class or has long periods of absence from school. You wondered how a young woman with so much potential could be slipping out of reach. And it turns out that Marla had never wanted to come to Canada and with her family, and she is deeply saddened to leave her grandparents and friends behind, knowing that her home country is politically and economically unstable. Compounded with her own struggles, she is now witnessing her mother fall into a deep depression since the family's arrival to Canada. Her mother is too scared to go outside and spends all of her time anxiously looking at social media to find out what is happening back in her home country. Marla's father is worried about his family, but he works 2 jobs and is at a loss for what to do. So he begins to spend less and less time at home and more time with his friends at work. When Marla goes home after class, she goes straight to her bed. She sleeps through to the next day and in the morning forces herself to get up and go back to her English class again. So I think it would be easy to overlook someone like Marla, or just think that she is either not ready to learn or she has always been a poor student. This is not an unusual case, and I can think most settlement practitioners have had this type of learner in their classroom or client in their office. So the questions that I asked was, what's going on? How does this make you feel? What can you do in ways to support? And who would you call on for support? So what's going on? Disconnection and alienation. We can all agree that Marla is experiencing disconnection and alienation since her arrival to Canada. Perhaps she is falling into a depression, she's worried about her mum and wonders about why her dad isn't around so much anymore. They are perhaps poorer than they had been in their first country. She is anxious about her grandparents and friends, anxious about what her new life will be like here. She didn't choose to be here. Her life has been turned upside down. She feels alienated and alone, living on the outside. And perhaps she isn't ready to cross over into really being present. She is too emotionally drained to care about learning. She is too distracted about the crises in her home country. She is disconnected from her mother and father. So how does it make you feel? So, for teachers, perhaps her lack of interest in school is frustrating. You see her potential, but she isn't interested, and nor is she embracing this opportunity to learn English in a government program which is free. And perhaps you're frustrated because you have other students that are making the effort and appreciate all the support you are giving them. You feel like she doesn't make any effort to connect with you or other students. And maybe you feel deflated and a loss for what to do. So how can you support her? So first, you need to be patient, and I mean really patient. You also need to not judge and assume that she is just assume that she's ungrateful or unwilling young lady needs to pull it together. Because in my experience, this is a situation that won't last forever. It will change. It may not change for the better, but it will change. So if you judge and perceive her as a problem in your class, then you are not only not helping, but you are doing harm. You need to remember that you have the power and privilege in this situation to either help and support, or you have the power and privilege to cause harm. So check your own attitudes and reflect on what you are doing that may be actually harmful rather than helpful. So if you find your intention is to support Marla, what can you do? So my suggestion is to spend more time with her. You be her partner in classroom activities, for example, and do kinesthetic activities such as the breathing like we did at the beginning of this webinar to focus her and other students on the present and for having that mind-body connection. Even if she's a higher learner, it will help her to have some mind-body connection so that she can regulate and balance her nervous system. Do some mindful stretching. You can take your class outside in the nicer weather and do some work in a park, or take your class for a walk and talk. Can you find another student in the class that you think would be a good match for Marla? And with your support, have them work together more often. Can you offer a quiet space in your school where Marla can take a break and make a cup of tea and have a quiet moment to herself? The purpose is for you to establish a connection with Marla so that she has a sense of support and perhaps some relief from her own internal struggles. If you can provide her with a distraction from herself, she can begin to break free of her emotional state, and in time, she'll begin to heal and move little by little forward. So there was a study out of the Harvard Trauma Sensitivity School and saying that hopelessness, self-blame, and lack of control are typical of the feelings that can result from trauma. These feelings may lead to overwhelming despair and a loss of the ability to imagine the future or hope that circumstances will change. People in this condition can be ill-prepared for the academic and social challenges of a classroom. You can make referrals, and this often is what I hear is the very first suggestion. Yes, of course, you should refer if you feel it's important and helpful. But also remember that getting one-to-one counseling is expensive and often have very long wait lists. It may be that someone, like Marla needs time and needs connection. You and or someone in your class may be better than therapy. If you say to yourself, it's not my job, I'm not here to do that type of work, I'm only here to teach English, then you lose the opportunity to build a community for your individual students. You also may cause harm by taking on the attitude of not wanting to know and passing it off. It's very, very important that if you have students or clients that are struggling, that you reach out and not just pass it off for someone else as though it's a problem. Because Marla isn't a problem. Marla is just having a hard time and she needs some connection. So, relational hope, facilitating and embracing connections with other newcomers with similar experiences. So there's a researcher, Dr. Sean Ginwright. He's a writer, an academic, and more importantly than anything, he's a real activist and community youth worker. And he works out of Oakland, California. He's written and researched a lot about hopeful practices and connections with inner city kids. And I think his work really translates well to immigrant and refugee experiences for those who have experienced trauma. What he says is personal connections with teachers greatly impact the social and emotional success of school experiences, particularly for children, but equally as important for adults seeking out ways to engage and have a sense of belonging. The classroom can be that way of creating connection. So teachers and outreach and support workers need to listen without judgment or silencing or dismissing. Practitioners should have a reasonable amount of knowledge of where newcomer students come from and encourage their trust and connection. So finding it within yourself to find out more about where people are coming from and not just what's in the media and the news, because they are only telling the really sensationalized stories, but finding out about the cultural practices or the food of a country that your students come or clients come from, or where do people usually go on holidays, those kinds of hopeful kind of discussions, rather than just talking about all the problems that are faced in that region of the world. And also understand that people like new immigrants and refugees face multiple social and economic barriers since arriving in Canada. And so your compassion and empathy is key here. And I will say also with Relational Hope that teachers also need a good support network and opportunities for building strong communities of practice with other instructors, so that they too can have the support that they need to address the concerns in their classroom and find support and guidance from others who may have had experienced similar issues within their practice. And that goes for outreach workers and childcare workers as well. That kind of level of support to build these kind of communities of practice, so communities of practice for students and communities of practice for teachers, is extremely helpful and helps to mitigate or to keep the kind of burnout under control that often occurs in this kind of work. Dr. Sean Ginwright also talks about restorative hope, restoring a sense of well-being and health in community, and healing opportunities such as restorative yoga practices, quality employment or volunteer training and employment opportunities, healing circles to discuss dreams and aspirations, and opportunities for self-reflection and self-expression. And restorative hope, which for us in settlement means perhaps not working on an individual basis, because there is no innovative way to deliver mental health and healing possibilities in community. As I said before, looking at Marla's story, something like referring Marla into a sort of therapy session or something, it's just too expensive and culturally not always appropriate or accessible. But community can restore hope, whether that be a classroom community or a neighborhood community, which can serve that need for connection. It can offer that space where, individuals can heal and answer those sort of existential questions, such as, what is my value now that I'm here? And what am I going to do with the rest of my life? What goals can I set up? What are some opportunities that I have never had before that I now have? These questions can be asked in these type of spaces where individuals can share, heal, and restore. So hope and healing in classrooms. Research findings show that newcomers that have minimal interactions with other cultures and exclusive interactions with their own heritage culture will make them feel more disconnected and alienated. So the goal here is to help newcomers find a balance between their new identity as a Canadian living in a multicultural society and the preserved identity with their cultural heritage. And this balancing act between the two can be created through religion and home life and neighborhoods and school and after school activities. And it's something, within my experience with PIRS, this is something that we really encourage and work towards, that we are building this idea of a community of English language learners that are also able to share between their identity from their own culture and their new identity and the things that they've learned since being here. When people feel isolated or they only stick to their own, they tend to have more and more feelings of disconnection and alienation. But when they are put into a situation where they are sharing their shared experiences and learning about different cultural practices, etc., there's more opportunities to find ways to connect. So we need to do things like value newcomers' knowledge and skills and their abilities. And we can do these things through sort of alternative projects that aren't maybe always used in English classes, for example, but they can be, and they can be sort of where language can be embedded in the project, so that they're not only just learning language, but they're also learning about connections and about answering other kinds of questions that they might have about their new life in Canada. So activities such as art projects where students can reflect and have a physical process can be really helpful. So for example, in this, I asked students to reflect on what their experience, knowledge, and skills and abilities they have that can help with their sense of identity, purpose, and value. So for this person, her identity is created around her family, taking care of her family, and having the skill to make clothes for her family. These reflections, which she came up with on her own, acknowledges and also documents some of her values and purpose in life. Reflecting on where people find meaningful and safe spaces in their new communities. Art projects really become a tangible representation of where a person is at. And this particular one was done as a group project, and it's a mural. And I asked the students to reflect on where they find refuge in their new community in Canada. And it helps often when you do collective projects like this, as it reinforces this understanding that our connections with each other really do exist, and we all have something important to contribute. The mere process of making art creates community and connection with others in similar circumstances to us, and thereby limiting those feelings of disconnection and alienation. We are all in this together. So in this mural, the places the women in the class found refuge was from anything from being in the bathtub to being in the English class to holding a child. These are all shared human experiences. Help find ways to embrace an authentic understanding of diversity, where everyone can engage and feel accepted. And know that through these collective experiences, we further understand diversity, and we can have the opportunity to feel welcomed, engaged, and accepted. Value transformative changes, and newcomers support their efforts in finding a new sense of meaning and purpose. And these can be done through discussions on goal setting, planning for the future, finding new activities that bring new experiences, such as art, or encouraging new ways of work, such as volunteering with settlement service agencies, so that they can share what they have learned. And perhaps exploring work opportunities or building leadership skills. Whatever it is, the effort to reestablish one's sense of meaning and purpose in the context of their new life in Canada will provide really positive, transformative change, diversity, and acceptance, which perhaps was not ever experienced prior to their arrival in Canada. So this brings me to post-traumatic growth. And I'm just going to read you this quote, a couple quotes. Post-traumatic growth is defined as the experience of individuals whose development, at least in some areas, has surpassed what was present before the struggle with crisis occurred. The individual has not only survived, but has experienced changes that are viewed as important and that go beyond the status quo. Individuals have described profound changes in their view of relationships, how they view themselves, and their philosophy of life. This is the hopeful message here about those people who have experienced trauma. When all is lost, the future still remains. So, and I'm saying this to remind yourself that there is always the future, and there is no guarantee that it will be a better one, but at least there is a chance that it might be. And we have to hold on to that. And, I know for myself, when I run into former students and I see where they are now from where they have come from, I'm always reminded of the great capacity of the human spirit to really hold on. And the resiliency we see is a real testament to that strength and capacity that we all have. And sometimes the suffering leads to greater understanding of how we can embrace and connect with each other. I think back to a particular student that I had where he really was, when I met him, was in a really difficult place. He was extremely angry, frustrated, wasn't settled in school, wanted, nothing but more than to be able to go home, basically, to where he originally came from. But that wasn't possible. But I have seen him throughout the years really develop and become such an amazing sort of person, and a huge contribution to his community and to this country. And it's just one of those reminders that where people are at is not, it's not where they're always going to stay. They're going to continue to move forward. And that kind of hopeful message is what we really need to help students and our clients to really understand. This is just a process. It's part of the migration journey. So when you look at things like what is a trauma-informed school, it's one in which all students feel safe, welcomed, and supported, and we're addressing trauma's impact on learning on a school-wide basis is at the center of its educational mission. So these tools, such as I talked about before, like breathing, kinesthetic learning, projects, art-based learning, restoring hope, creating relationships of hope, are all what we mean by trauma-informed. And we also need to bring it to an institutional level so that the systems themselves are sensitive to the issues of trauma newcomers face. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying, what is a trauma-informed school? It's known institutionally, and it's understood as embedded into the mission of the school, rather than it just be, well, this person has, had a lot of experiences of trauma. We don't know who's experienced trauma, and so by applying it all over and throughout the community or out the school is way more helpful than trying to pinpoint those who are struggling versus those who are not. When you look at trauma-informed community spaces, things like reducing environmental stress or stimuli, keeping the doors and windows open if possible, allow participants in the classroom to take breaks from the class when they need it, daily practices of kinesthetic experiences, such as yoga or mindfulness meditation, providing a quiet space in your school with dim lights that feel safe and warm. And if we can do this on all sites, like classrooms and other community spaces, that's going to enable people to really understand that they are, part of a community, that they are supported, and that we can hold the space for them. Self-care. So I talked about this a little bit in the last webinar, but I do want to just touch on it again and say that build practices that support your own healing and well-being. Create opportunities to build relationships within your own professional network for better support. Understand that, trauma experiences from others can also affect your ability to do good work, and that things like vicarious trauma and burnout are real and really need to be addressed by you and perhaps also by the organizations you work for. You know, I have heard over and over many, many stories of people's loss and suffering, and it has definitely changed my own perceptions of the world and how I, go through this world. Um, I also think that, by really recognizing that your ability to recognize your own trauma will also help in creating connections and relationships with people that have also experienced trauma, because in fact nobody has not had a traumatic experience in their life. So it's building on that shared understanding of what it means to heal and having a sense of well-being. So I will say this in closing: build your practice that support not only your clients or your students' mental well-being, but also adds to your own healing and well-being. Reach out to your coworkers and your managers for support, and be willing to share your experiences and expertise within this sector. And more than anything, make sure you do no harm to others or yourself. I'm going to end here and just offer you, if you have any questions or comments, and also I will provide you with my contact information once we've done the questions and comments, if that works for you, Sabrina.
Yes, it does, and thank you, Diana, for leading us through this presentation. So we will be sharing Diana's contact information following this Q&A portion, but please feel free to submit your questions for Diana using the question box, or by alternatively emailing them to events@amsa.org. And so we have been receiving a few questions already, and I do welcome more questions. One of the phrases that you used earlier was authentic understanding of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate and explain that a little bit more?
Well, when we're talking about sort of what I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about cultural diversity, in understanding through this what we mean in the settlement sector. So, you know, there are two sort of thoughts around understanding culture, and then understanding cultural diversity. So, you know, there's one which is understanding culture through a measured level of competence. So how well you understand other people's culture based on, you know, measuring your understanding of that culture. Or rather, the other side of it, which really comes from the health sector, is understanding cultural humility, which means to not make any assumptions about any other culture, that people from a particular culture can have also within their culture, they are also individuals. And so really recognizing that you need to do more listening and asking more questions around diversity and culture to be able to work within that framework of what it means to acknowledge and be authentic about our own cultural diversity. So, you know, not making sweeping generalizations about one particular culture over another, recognizing that you won't know the answers to everything, and asking more questions about where people are at, where they're coming from in terms of understanding their own, you know, cultural heritage. So in that sense, that's what I'm sort of implying around being authentic about it, and not just being very superficial in your understanding of what people, what you think people are in terms of their cultural identity.
Well, thank you, Diana, for expanding and elaborate and clarifying that terminology phrase that you used. Another question that we received is from an individual who's supporting clients, and their challenge is that the client is refusing the help that they're liking to offer their 12-year-old child who is suicidal, and the reason the parents are refusing this help is because of stigma associated with that.
Right.
And so the individual is asking, what should I be doing, or what are options that you could suggest?
Right. So I think, that's a really intense and heavy situation for you to be in, and feeling, overwhelmed perhaps, or maybe responsible for providing this family with the right kind of information. And I think that, one thing that could be helpful is that if you are from the same cultural group as this person or this family, there might be the worry that you or some, your connections to the community are so strong that they are worried about the stigma associated it because you are also part of that culture. Sometimes it can be helpful if somebody can talk to the family that's really from outside of that cultural group, because then the stigma can feel less intense. It's sort of like when everybody knows what's happening to somebody in the neighborhood, and it's the same kind of thing, because often these cultural groups tend to stick together. They know each other more because they're smaller, and you have one group of Somalian families living in one area and they're worried about it, or another group of whoever, Croatian families living in another area. So all of these things can lead to people feeling insecure and unsure about how their reputation is going to be perceived in their own community. So by providing perhaps somebody from outside of the community to offer some help, and then if that's not a possibility, I would say going about it slowly, very, very carefully, trying to get their reassurance from you that there's a level of confidentiality that you agree with, that you have signed on to, and that you wouldn't be sharing any of that information with anybody else. That suicide is a real possibility in this case, and that it's an urgent matter. So stigma should really kind of be off the table. But I think you do have to go about it really, really carefully, and just winning over that kind of trust, or providing another avenue through outside of that cultural group that can maybe step in to help and mitigate, sort of lessen the insecurity and worry about the stigma in their own cultural community.
So thank you, Diana, for sharing and providing some different examples for that individual. Somebody else wrote, and touching upon what you talked about in terms of self-care.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying that yes, self-care is very important, particularly for individuals working in the settlement sector. And they wanted to know if you had any practical suggestions of some self-care practices that you think would be most effective.
Yeah, I mean, I do talk more about self-care in the first webinar, but certainly, okay, so I have two thoughts about this. I think sometimes we can overdo the idea of self-care being that this is just something else that now you have to add to the many things that you do all day, is to also look after yourself. So just knowing that also sometimes self-care is not always possible if you've got a whole lot of other responsibilities. But if you do have the time and you are committed to trying to make sure that you don't burn out or you don't experience vicarious trauma, there's research has been done by the David Suzuki Foundation on how spending just half an hour a day outside can really, really support people with really stressful jobs, and having that opportunity to go for a walk, be in nature, be in a park, in the picnics outside in the summertime, those kinds of activities can really, really help. It also helps if you have, you know, a social network outside of this type of work, that you are connected in different ways to other types of communities and other friends that have nothing to do with this type of job, that you're not sharing that information, you know, what's going on at work with them. You're actually talking about totally different things, and you have other interests. And, you know, those, you know, what everyone always says, you know, having hobbies and other activities that will help to, you know, help you to find other ways of kind of relief from this type of work. And also just reminding yourself that this type of work is in effect a kind of social activism, and that can be a form of self-care in and of itself. You're in an enviable position if you're working in this field, in the sense that you have this opportunity to have a lot of value and meaning in the work that you do every day. And to not forget that that is, for many of us that want those kinds of connections, that is a kind of self-care within itself, because you're practicing your values and you have a lot of meaning and purpose in your daily life by going to work every day. We all want the spa days and, you know, the expensive yoga practices or whatever, but it's not always possible to have. But I do think if you can find ways to, you know, spend some time journaling or doing a bit of exercise in the morning, going out for walks in the evening, having friends that are not part of this work, talking and sharing about other experiences that you have, and having hobbies and interests, that is what is most helpful. And then making sure that you also have a good community of practice within your work that can support you in what you're doing at work. So having your managers and your, you know, program coordinators there to help you when you are struggling with students or clients, so that you have somebody to talk to about what's going on within the organization you're working for.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. I know that it's so important to be connected to nature and have that connection in terms of self-care. And so for myself, the biggest thing that I do for myself in terms of self-care is that I'm able here at AMSA to take my dog with me to work.
Right.
And I've realized and seen the benefit that my colleagues also experience just by petting him and cuddling and playing with him. So having those mini kind of self-care moments, I think, are very valuable, and it's not always the big, larger events that matter.
Right. Yeah, pets are kind of amazing for that. They have a real quality and calming to them. And, you know, they're now used in, you know, prisons and hospitals and other institutions where there's a lot of anxiety and stress and depression. And so there's definitely something to that. Just in the same way as I was talking about, you know, how to provide that kind of self-care that students can, or clients maybe can pick up for their own use, you know, by following your example of what you do, following those breathing techniques, bringing in somebody into the classroom, or having a workshop on self-care and well-being is really, really helpful for everybody. So, and it just kind of spreads from there, you know. So yeah, it's inspiring when people do look after themselves, I think.
So, Diana, the next question that we received, I think really relates back to that art project that you were sharing in terms of the classroom. And so the individual asked, how can I incorporate more alternate projects to value my learners' skills when not everyone in the classroom wants to take part in those projects or takes a lot of time to facilitate? This individual mentioned that they've tried different workstations, but that it took a lot of time for them as the teacher to prepare, and their healing mindset kind of slipped throughout it. They were focusing more on the activity and the project than on the aspect that was meant for healing. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that's helpful is if you take quite a long time to build up to the project, so that there may be healing circles, conversation circles that talk about the issue or what the art project is about. So not just sort of landing it on students on a day when they're not expecting it, but knowing that there's some lead up to it, and knowing that for sure some people are not interested in doing art projects, but if they but it's helpful if it's not a sort of an arduous task with gets too messy or things like that. So that's why things that I like are collages or simpler projects, and then combining that where you are leading up to it with all sorts of other sort of processes that help to lead into the artwork itself, so that when people are doing, say, for example, a mural together, that people can add in a lot or not too much, based on what their interest is in the project. But before you have gotten to the mural, you've done a lot of work on processing what it is that you're trying to achieve by doing this art project, why it's important, why you think that it would be a good thing for students to do. So there needs to be like kind of a buy-in first, so before you actually do it, because otherwise it feels like it's kind of like the teacher's agenda rather than it's really that useful for students. So building up to it, going slowly, having other activities around the sort of a perspective, question, or point of view that you're trying to make. So for example, when I was doing the mural, the collective mural on where places people find refuge, we had already done a lot of vocabulary on places in community, and we had done some spelling on it. We had, built in different sort of language pieces into it, so that by the time they got to do the mural, it was there was, they could see the value and purpose in it. So that project almost becomes like the end point. And some people will really enjoy the process, and others less so. But I think that everyone can contribute to something like that in whatever way they feel like doing. You're not gonna, if people are absolutely refusing to do the art project, it might be that you kind of landed it on them too soon, and you need to go back and take steps towards the project itself. So before you even get to saying that we're going to be doing this art project, get them talking about the topic that you want them to talk about first.
So if you do have a follow-up to that, please feel free to submit your question, and I'll follow up with Diana on that question. The next question, Diana, is really regarding creating trauma-informed spaces within classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that you mentioned. And so the individual is asking, what measures would you suggest in taking this further? How can we create trauma-informed spaces, say within our residential environments or more within our neighborhoods?
You mean like a residential, like a neighborhood, like a housing
Like a
residential
house,
kind of
like
thing?
as my understanding, just like within like a house or like a neighborhood.
When we're thinking about sort of like a home, I think that it again applies the same kind of way that it might apply to classrooms, like being really open and available to make connections with people, offering the space where people feel safe and comfortable in sharing experiences, and feeling that they have a trusted neighbor or a trusted person in the community that they can talk to about the things that are worrying or concerning them. I think that just like in a classroom, I've talked about having bits, some representation of nature being really important. So in terms of community, building those things like parks and like shared community spaces that are natural as possible. And in the same ways that can be in a home, like having things around that represents the things that we find peaceful in our environment. So, pictures of nature scenes, plants and flowers, things that are calming to our senses and to our minds. I think that also not just visual, but other sensory things like smells and pleasant smells and, domestic kind of safe and secure smells. Those are one of the things that can be a real trigger for people with trauma, is the sense of smell is very strong. And you never know when people are triggered by smell, but having things like, essential oils available, having, flowers that smell, pretty, those kinds of things can be really helpful. And then also things like having quiet spaces, having places where somebody can check out and have some time to themselves, just to not have to talk, to not have to produce, to not have to focus, but they can just be in a sort of more meditative state and reflective on their own. Those things are super helpful. And then offering things like cups of tea and just knowing that somebody is out there that cares for them is also really, really essential, I think, for people who are really struggling with trauma experiences and memory. Yeah.
Thank you, Diana. The next question is an individual would like some tips or some suggestions on how to support or help a client or a student if they do not want to talk, and if they who responds in an angry or an aggressive manner.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not that unusual. First of all, people don't want to talk, then, they don't want to talk. I don't, it's okay. I think that you just have to check your own agenda. So this is really hard for teachers because we want the best for our students and we're there to teach them English. And when they're not willing to do the work, then we feel somehow that they are not meeting the expectations of the teacher. But they're not going to meet the expectations of your teacher anyway if that's how they're feeling. So I think it's really important just to be okay with where people are at and not force your expectations onto them. This can be where, this can lead to that kind of sense of real disconnection for students and for clients. And it can also lead to the teacher or the outreach worker also to feel like really that disconnection from the person, from the student. So I think it's really important just to check that you are not doing harm, meaning that you're not judging them, you're not having expectations on them that they cannot meet, and at the same time just holding space so that they can feel accepted and feel that that there's a lot of trust there for you. Because when somebody is acting with anger and aggression, the first thing you want to, what many people want to say are things like, well, if you're not going to follow the rules, then you have to leave, that kind of thing. And that's like the typical way that, that's the typical response and the expected response from people. But I think that if you can just hold the space for people and show that level of compassion and empathy, you will be amazed at how in time that level of aggression and, real despair that people feel can lessen. And there can be a moment of real connection, especially if it's really authentically coming from you. And you're saying that it's okay, that I can hold this. You can, not be abusive, obviously, but you can accept that they are not happy and that they are feeling, that life is not what they expected it to be. Because that's often what it is that people just don't know how to manage those feelings when, the world has in some ways betrayed them, that they have had to go through this traumatic experience of leaving their first country and coming here, who wouldn't be angry and upset about that? So it's just really showing that level of compassion and empathy and just holding space for them, saying, I'm here anyway. If you want to talk, I'm here. And just making that available and making it aware that they can, when they're ready, connect with you. And you'll wait for it. It's just easier. I mean, I often think this for myself, like, it's so easy for me to be kind or be nice. I've got everything that I need, right? So, you know, it's thinking about it on those in that way. You know, people are behaving the way that they behave because they're at a loss for something and they're alienated. There's a scarcity of something, and that's just a normal human reaction to those things. So, being patient, showing compassion, being empathetic is really the best thing that you can do for somebody like that. And just being there, just holding that space and saying it's available whenever you're ready. And if you're not, that's cool. No pressure.
Okay, thank you, Diana. And a follow-up question came to that, and you may have touched upon it a little bit in your answer, but I'll just bring it forward anyways. The individual asked, what should they do if the client or student is continuously coming and showing up at the program, but is not talking?
Right.
And so what should the next steps be that they should do?
So the fact that they're showing up in the program means that they are wanting to get something from the program. That in itself shows that that person has a great deal of resiliency, and there is this sense of hope. You could see that things could possibly change, and so that in a positive way. So I think that again, it's this idea of just being really patient. I know that I had a student that was like that. He didn't talk for maybe 3-4 months, but she kept showing up. She didn't say a word the entire time she was there. But I would sit near her and I would always look at her, with a great deal of, making sure that I was connecting with her. I was never judging her. I was never sort of showing like a puzzled face at her, like what's wrong. I just let her take the time to be there. And then she did start talking. And it was probably, I think it was 3.5 months in. If you think that there are other issues like, hearing issues, or she has no speech, then, you could ask other people that are in her support network. So it might be her parents or friends, or not friends, but other settlement workers that know this person, and see if you can get some more information. But if it's just that, but she's just not there and not talking, but she is there, and that is something. And I think hold on to that. That's the main thing, and just see how long it takes and how far this will go, because oftentimes I do find that people will start talking when they're ready to. So just be patient and know that there's something there for that person, because she is showing up to the class, and that's really helpful.
Okay, thank you, Diana. So the next question is really in regards to Marla's case study. And so this individual found the case study very helpful for their daily practice. And they wanted to ask if you could give a bit more hands-on advice on how to work with a disruptive or angry student.
Right. So, and I did talk a little bit about that sort of situation in the first webinar, but I'll say again that you do sometimes come across these kind of students that are maybe more aggressive, just angry and volatile, and you're not exactly sure what's going on. I know for me that I worked in a youth program for a refugee youth program for a long time, and I had these experiences, particularly with younger men kind of thing, who were just, yeah, like they didn't want to do the art project that I had, or they just were, you know, really angry that they were there. They didn't like being told what to do. They didn't like the school, or, you know, they didn't like me. They didn't like anything about what was going on in their life. They didn't like Canada. They didn't like the people. They didn't like the classmates. They didn't like the school. They didn't like the teacher. Everything was really not good. And it was, you know, there was that sense of urgency and aggression in their actions and their voice. And it is kind of daunting and a little bit unnerving for teachers to have to deal with that. But I think, again, it's back to that patience and holding space and just being there for them and just not being daunted. They're expecting to push buttons so that they can get the expected response from you, saying that, you know, you got to leave the class, you know, we're not, you know, you can't behave this way. As long as the person is not endangering other people or yourself, then it's just ability to create boundaries and hold space. So when we're saying boundaries, we're saying, if you have choices, like you don't want to do this activity, that's fine. Don't worry about it. You sit there, and when you're ready, you can join us. But if you don't want to, that's super cool. I have no problem with that. If they're showing up late to class and they're angry when they come into class, you can ask them to set up a time that does work for them to come to class. So if you're saying you know they're arriving at 9:15, and if you're saying to that, look, you can't do that, you have to come to class at 9, that may be the case, but maybe there's another way to address it. Like maybe you could say, okay, so is this time that you're coming every day 9:15? If this is what you need to do, then we're going to make that a rule. So kind of like more working with the person and not being, you know, so affected by the sort of intensity or perhaps level of aggression. And at the same time, just being able to listen and getting them to try and tell you what their concerns are, what's going on for them, and not, you know, it's that active listening where you're just really paying attention to what they're saying, you're acknowledging what they're saying, you're you know, paraphrasing back, so this is what you're feeling, asking good questions to them, and then just letting them be that, letting them be, you know, upset, or letting them be angry, and not trying to fix it for them, because you're not going to be able to fix it exactly unless it's like, you know, a grammar question or something. But, you know, you're not going to be able to necessarily fix their problem. But you can listen, and you can understand, and you can show that level of empathy and trust that you are there to be part, you know, as part of their life, and that you want to be there for them. And just making that door open, keeping that door open so that they can choose how it is that they want you to be part of their life, kind of thing. So trying to reestablish for themselves that sense of control and creating that sense of connection with you.
Okay, thank you, Diana. There's another follow-up question to Marla's case study scenario. And the individual found this very helpful. And this individual works in a link program as an instructor, but they feel that sometimes very hard to convince their boss that it would be okay to let Marla step out of the class, or to modify classroom elements for students like her. For example, it would be challenging to offer to do one or two fewer assignments or activities, particularly as it's always linked to reporting. Do you have any suggestions or ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I know, and PBLA is a big thing where, you know, you're having to do assessments, and those assessments go into students' portfolios, and helps them to move through levels and all of those things. So I think what I think you need to have a proper sit down conversation with your management team and find out what it is, like what if you can provide a good argument as to why you think it's important and what the purpose is for why you feel like you need to allow somebody like Marla to take a step back. You know, that's what I used to do when I was teaching. I would, you know, if I said to the management team that I was working with, you know, this person needs some time, I was met with real understanding from my managers. And I think that it's really important that for teachers to have the backup from the management so that they can do their job in the best way for their students. Those timeouts are really important. The rigor that is required from Link doesn't always match the need of the student population, particularly refugees, where they have so many other things going on in their life that English language learning is not always a big priority. It may be something that they feel they have to do, and they're, you know, happy to be in a class like Link, but there's competing interests, there's competing needs, and you know, I think that as an instructor, you have your agenda, but listening to what the student has as far as what's on her plate, like Marla, and just allowing, you know, with great compassion and great understanding for the process of her settlement process to be, you know, not adding to the pain and not adding to the anxiety, but just being there as just part of the healing piece that she needs in her life at that particular moment. So I would email your manager or coordinator. I would have a proper sit-down conversation and figure out some ways that in policy in your organization that you can address those issues of trauma, because I do feel like they're not addressed enough in many of the settlement organizations in language classes.
Okay, thank you, Diana. A follow-up question to that one is, do you have any phrases or sort of statements that you would recommend somebody use when they do bring that forward to their higher ups about some of these suggestions that you have?
I think that you need to, well, I don't know about phrases so much as I would say you need to explain the situation as much as you know it. So you have this student or that student who is displaying these type of behaviors. You're concerned and you want an opportunity to provide the space in the classroom to be a place of healing rather than a place of anxiety. So offering it as a way that you're phrasing it in terms of a support system rather than from this person has to meet, this is our protocol and they have to meet this criteria, et cetera, et cetera. That works for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody. And, you know, we want to make sure that we cause no additional harm to people. So, and if you are coming at students with trauma with, you know, high levels of expectations, that can be just another thing that they fail at. And that's going to be another cause of harm. And I think that students really do feel that. And I think that it really does need to be addressed on a more policy level within settlement organizations.
Okay, thank you for those suggestions, Diana. The next individual has asked for some assistance in talking with a coworker.
Mm-hmm.
So how can I make my coworker understand that people need time and they're allowed to hold back their cultural practice, that not to expect too much from newcomers? Just because they are in Canada physically doesn't mean that they're mentally here or ready to accept the Canadian way yet.
Right. Yeah.
Do you have any tips for how somebody could talk to their coworker?
Right, because you hear those things like people say, well, now you're in Canada. In Canada, we are
Yes.
this and that. Yeah. So I always like to, I know this is kind of, it's slightly passive aggressive how I deal with this, but I like to ask back questions and personalize it for them. So you know, by getting other people, like other practitioners in this work, teachers, etc., to really reflect on how it would be for them if they were in those situations. So trying to ask them questions, leading questions that maybe they would say, well, they wouldn't have the answer to. So, I remember, when somebody was asking me about somebody not, never, doing the homework or whatever it was, and just how, this is, you're in Canada now, buck up, you got to do, you got to get it together. So I would ask questions like, well, why? Well, why is that? Why is that like a thing that they need to do? You're just saying that, like, where is the evidence that you can show me that they need to do anything? You are, it's their decision, it's their life, that kind of thing. And I know that people often come from, they want to really support. It's a way of they're thinking that it's a way of supporting by sort of being a bit hard on and having these expectations. So I think it's just better if you get your colleague to reflect on why it is that they feel the way they do. Like what evidence do they have that would support having that kind of attitude, and seeing if that can help. You can also, reiterate the things that your colleague should already know, like imagine yourself in this situation and imagine how difficult it would be, and thinking about all the losses that you've had in your life, and then getting them to really sort of acknowledge the compassion and empathy that they should have. And I think it's really important that you phrase these things not in a way that is trying to get people to feel sorry for people that have had trauma through their migration journeys, but just to show the compassion rather than sympathy, so that it's more around a shared experience, that if you were in that situation, you would be this way, or you wouldn't, this would be hard for you too, kind of thing, rather than being, this poor, weak character, this person who's weak and has no sense of agency or ability to do anything. That's not helpful. So getting colleagues to work on their compassion, work on their understanding of empathy, and work on knowing about how hard it is, and understanding how hard it is to go through this process of settlement as well. And then asking them back the questions, how would you do it, kind of thing.
Thank you, Diana. And the individual made a follow-up comment, just also in regards to explaining to their colleagues, and having understanding that students have different cultural practices or holidays that often conflict with during the week or the month with the school schedule.
Right.
Just to have compassion and understanding regarding that as well.
Yeah, and it's also, that's true, and it's also it's going to take time for people to understand. Like, if you're usually able to pray 5 times a day, and maybe you might end up with a job where that isn't going to be possible to do, but you can help the student to find other ways of facilitating their practice, their spiritual practices. You can find alternative ways, because those kinds of things, in Canada aren't easily accepted by, say, bosses and that kind of thing. So you're not doing anybody, you're not necessarily doing a favor by telling the student, it's fine, we've got all this space and room for you to do whatever you want to do. It's more important to figure out a way that they can do that to do what they need to do in a way that's going to work for them and work for their work and work for their school life and all that kind of thing. So it's kind of just like coming up with solutions together, rather than saying, judging it and that.
All right, thank you, Diana. You talked earlier about how settlement organizations could create spaces that are trauma informed. So one of the questions is, how can agencies implement a well-integrated response to address trauma affected refugees or newcomer families' complex needs?
So I think with more training for outreach workers and teachers on trauma-informed practices, having a school that has integrated a trauma-informed practice within the organization, meaning they have provided quiet space for students, for example, that need a timeout and away from other people. Creating events within the class and outside where people can find opportunities for connection, having within the curriculum the kind of questions that they can pose to students around value and meaning and identity. That's what I mean by being a trauma sensitive agency, a trauma informed agency, that knowing that trauma exists within these populations, that it may show up within classrooms, and that there are policies and ways to respond to people's experiences of trauma, and that integrating activities and integrating activities into the sort of the daily life of newcomer students into programs. Really working hard at making sure that everyone feels a sense of connection and belonging to the organization, so that they know that they are welcome and they can knock on doors and get help when they need it, and that there is no sense of stigma, that the people that work in the organization, that there's no need to worry about that within it. But it does take a lot of work in terms of on an organizational level to make those a primary goal, that all of the staff at an organization, from the front desk to the teachers to the managers, that they are all trauma informed. So it's even things like, not like you're recognizing that you may have shock, or your facial expressions can give it away, that you're judging people, that you are being inclusive, that you are accepting everybody in from where they're at, and that sensitivity and level of awareness, self-awareness, needs to be practiced within the organization, and there needs to be more sort of workshops and awareness around that for all workers in an organization.
Thank you, Diana. You mentioned earlier something about newcomers finding connections with people who are not just settlement service providers.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, what kinds of community groups or organizations are good to recommend that newcomers join to have connections outside of these regular circles? The individual saying that sometimes it's really hard to search and access these groups and find out about them, and it's challenging for their clients to search and find these groups online.
Yeah. I mean, in one of the curriculums that I've written, or the resources that I've written, is meetup groups, for example. And this can be something that you can do as a sort of classroom activity, where people research different sort of meetup groups that they may want to join, and then there can be like a kind of follow through, so that there's a little bit of hand holding within it, that they can maybe go with, a couple of people from the class to a certain meetup group. Maybe they want to do, I don't know, hiking or something like that, and there's a group that meets on Saturday mornings or whatever, or walking around the seawall or anything. So it's really hard to do those things when you're not from the dominant culture and you're not sure what is expected or how you're supposed to introduce yourself and all that kind of thing. So if you can support it by things like having people partner up and do it as a sort of over the weekend project, and then they come back and report on it, that can be one way of sort of providing that space of getting out of the way of sort of just being in the settlement service sector and always meeting other people from your own cultural group, etc. If you're trying to expand, it takes a lot of effort on the part of the client or the student to do that, but you can help that by sort of offering your guidance and support on how to do that with community groups outside of settlement services. And then other things could be like, the old standby, the old volunteering, but that does help to create connections for people outside of it. And it's, especially if it's something that's very regular, like once a week or twice a week that they're doing, not just one-off, we need people to help set up for this festival or whatever, but actually a regular kind of activity that people are doing to meet new people. That's how a lot of people do it in Canada. And then maybe other things like, libraries and joining book clubs, sporting events, joining a basketball group at a community center, all of those things. And it does take a certain level of confidence to be able to just go in there and do it on your own. But oftentimes those are the best ways I've found for people to really break free and get outside of the safety of just being always in settlement, and when they're ready for it, right? So neighborhood houses as well can be helpful for community groups as well.
Okay, thank you, Diana. And you touched upon this a little bit, but I think the person is looking for some greater depth on this question. That sometimes clients with trauma express that native speakers and people in the community don't have the sensitivity or patience to listen and understand them. What are the best ways to communicate to newcomers the positive or negative capacity of people outside of the settlement sector? The individual is wondering, do I just tell them something, or do I just listen and be the example support that they need as a student? But how can I explain that maybe not everyone outside in the community is as understanding?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean by kind of being lucky in a way that we work in this field, because we do have that deeper understanding of what people are going through. And, people are far from perfect, and they're also living within their own bubble and their own concerns and issues and life experience. And meeting newcomers, refugees, may not be something that they've ever really come across in their life before. So it's just really having that understanding that people are not always easy to talk to, and they're not easy. It's not, they don't want to for you to disclose all of their your own issues of trauma, etc. But certainly within your work and the settlement work that you're doing, I think that just knowing that they have you that is there, that they can share their thoughts and their concerns, and that you are giving them the space to do that, may be enough for them. And just saying, also just acknowledging that it's not easy is really helpful, because sometimes when you're trying to fix it for them, or saying, oh, that they shouldn't be like that, or being kind of negative about the society or whatever, that's not helpful. That's kind of more sort of feeling alienated, like you are agreeing with them that it's hard to talk to people. But if you just listen and just acknowledge what they're saying, and saying that you are there to that they can share their experiences with you, that is all you can do. And just say, I hear you. Yeah, that's really tough, and reiterating their disappointment and that kind of thing, but not offering solutions or trying to fix it for them, because you can't fix other people. So you can just be there as a support for that person.
Thank you, Diane. And the final questions that we've received were about the first webinar that you presented. So I've posted a link to that webinar in the chat, so everyone should be able to access and see that link, and it's on the AMSA webpage. And so the final question that I also received was about if this webinar will be also shared and posted online. I'm like, yes, it's being recorded. Our Connor Connor Aslan, our AV coordinator, will be editing and we'll be posting that online, and it will be shared out with everyone, and a notification will be going up on SettlementNet that the webinar is online. So I'd like to just move it to the final slide, and just so that you can share your contact information with everyone, and just maybe say a few closing words, and thank you so much to everyone who's been part of this so far.
Yeah, so if you want to contact me, I have put up my email address and my office phone number. And I'm, webinars are one way of trying to get this message out, but I also do workshops and presentations with some really sort of applicable, I think, activities that you can do with students and clients in the sector. And then we also have PIRS published resources that are also available upon request. So if you're interested, we have one on community-based training guide for It's a Trauma-Informed Practice. We have a Newcomer Women's Health guide that's available. BC Teal has also got a men's health guide that is available on their website. And then we also have a trauma-informed EAL curriculum that is available as well. So you're welcome to contact me if you want those resources. And just to say that, I know how challenging this work can be and how easy it is to kind of burn out from being, especially a frontline teacher, provider in the sector. It is as much as it is hard, it's also the best experiences that I've had in my own working life is having the kinds of connections, the kinds of opportunities to meet the people that I have met throughout the years has been a real life-changing experience for me. And I think just to remember that your value, you're so valuable to the communities that you work for, because you are frontline making the changes, helping people to move forward with their lives in incredibly, oftentimes really incredibly difficult circumstances. And so just being there for them, being there as a support, causing no harm, and moving this conversation forward to really include a trauma sensitivity into the classroom is really what's going to make our programs so much better. And it will also mean that you as a practitioner will be able to work with people in a way that is healing not only for them, but also for you. I think one of the things that I've learned more than anything is that the trauma and suffering that people have faced often leads to a real greater sense of what it means to be alive, what it means to be what is really the most important aspects of being human. And I think that you getting the opportunity to see that come into fruition for people is a real privilege opportunity for you to take. So don't take your work without knowing that you're making a huge difference in people's lives, and move forward with that knowledge. So thank you very much for everyone for listening in, and I hope I was helpful in some way, and I look forward to hearing from you if you're interested to talk more.
So thank you, Diana. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with the settlement sector, and I've gotten quite a few messages of thank you to you as well. Thank you to Connor Aslan for also supporting us through the technical aspects of today's webinar. As mentioned before, this is being recorded, will be posted and shared online on the AMSA website. And I'd like to thank everyone for contributing all your questions, and hope you have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.